Love is a big emotion. It drives many urges and fuels us to do things we may not normally do. It has the power to mend or break hearts, and in many ways it can push us to our limits. It is unsurprising then that we often encounter impulsive crimes of passion between couples. This is a story of unrequited love and humiliation that seemingly pushed a man to the edge. This polarizing case, however, mixes love with entertainment, a combination that would prove to be deadly.
Now, which of these ways would you choose to reveal your secret crush on someone? A, would you write that person a letter? B, would you tell the person in private in case he rejects you? Or C, would you tell that person that you're gay and you hope he is on national television?
On January the 26th, 1963, Scott Amedure was born in Pittsburgh, Minnesota to Frank and Patricia. The family moved to Michigan, and unfortunately, shortly after this, Frank and Patricia separated. This left the kids to be raised alone by their truck-driving father. One of the boys, named Scott, was a high school dropout. He left to join the army early on. There he served 3 years, making it to the rank of specialist, before returning to Michigan following an honorable discharge. As he grew, Scott lived a quiet life, but was described to be a social butterfly by everyone around him. His chatty nature served him well. He found himself in a telesales role, and he worked that job for a short period following his time in the forces. However, he would later take a bartending position at Club Flamingo in Pontiac, a job that suited him and his social nature down to the ground. Scott, now 34 years old, was proudly gay, and Club Flamingo was a gay bar. Remember, we are talking about the early 90s here, so attitudes towards him were different than the modern day. The decades preceding the early 90s and the height of HIV and AIDS awareness meant that perceptions of the LGBTQ+ community were far different than what we see in society now. At a time when the world held very judgmental views, Scott seemed to be one of the lucky few who had a family that loved him and supported him regardless. As well as them, he had plenty of friends too. Scott became good friends with a woman named Donna Riley. She lived in the same apartment complex as his brother, who he would visit regularly. On one of these visits, he would encounter 24-year-old Johnathan Scmitz. He was a close friend of Donna's too, and he was working on her car. Scott struck up a casual conversation, and through their mutual friend Donna, the three would begin to occasionally hang out. However, it would soon become apparent that Scott was interested in more than just friendship from the 24-year-old. But to try and understand what happens next, we need to go back in time 3 or 4 months and take a look at a national TV show that would light a fire that just couldn't be put out. The show was one of Scott's favourite talk shows, to be exact. The Jenny Jones Show followed the typical format of the myriad of chat shows that rose to popularity in the early 90s. They were cheap and easy to pump out, a rinse and repeat type show that made a producer rub their hands in glee as they watched their ratings soar. Think the Jerry Springer Show, but less fake. And nothing boosted viewers like Scandals and Secrets. The juicier and more controversial, the better. And the ratings would have certainly soared the day that Scott, Donna and Johnathan appeared as Jenny Jones guests for some jaw-dropping revelations. Only the episode shot on the 6th of March 1991 in front of a live studio audience would never make it to air, and for good reason. The pre-taped broadcast became the catalyst that led one of them to do the unthinkable. Johnathan asked to participate in an episode where his crush would be revealed, although in a twist he was told it could be a man or a woman. However, later paperwork evidence would reveal that he was coerced into believing the latter. He identified as straight and expressed a lack of interest if there was a man involved. However, this episode of Jenny Jones was entitled Same-Sex Crushes, so that should have been a pretty strong clue as to what could have been happening on the chat show stage. any televised crush revelation from a friend you had no interest in could and probably would lead to embarrassment, regardless of the genders involved. So Scott's decision to apply to be on the show was an intriguing one. In the back of his mind, the ex-army specialist must have known it might make things uncomfortable. At certain times, we all take chances, but no one could have predicted just how quickly things would escalate. In the episode footage that would later be shown in court, Johnathan waited backstage to meet his crush. He was hoping it was his ex-girlfriend wanting him back in her life. Instead, on stage, Scott admits his attraction for the guy waiting backstage, describing his first encounter with Jonathan's lower half beneath Donna's car. When he is asked about Jonathan's orientation, he replies that,
"No.
Anything's possible."
Okay, you think about you have fantasies about him?
I've had a couple, yeah.
Yeah, you had when he was under the car, you had a fantasy about him.
Yeah, something to do with like brake oil, line snapping, and...
Tell us about, you have another one that involved, you were in a hammock or something? Tell us about that fantasy.
He then went on to share a detailed fantasy that he wanted to try, one that included a hammock, champagne, and whipped cream.
Brilliant. Get the headphones off of John and let's have John come out here and see who has the crush on him. Here's John.
When Johnathan finally made his appearance and sees his friends, he notably slows, but he does paste a large smile onto his face. Knowing what we know now, this was probably just for the audience and the cameras. He must have been confused and maybe a little irritated because, as we would later learn, he had actually asked the pair if they knew anything about the show when he had initially been invited by the production. 24-year-old Johnathan appears to take things well, on the surface at least. He kisses Donna and offers Scott to shake his hand, but Scott quickly pulls him in for a hug that Johnathan notably tries not to participate in. He takes a seat next to Scott, with his smile still masking his obvious discomfort. The host tries to stretch out the suspense by asking him if he thinks Donna could be his crush.
Did you think Donna had the crush on you?
Did I? No, we're good friends.
Johnathan, sensing the situation, disagrees. She moves quickly on to reveal it was actually Scott who wanted the relationship.
Well, guess what? It's Scott that has the crush on you.
You lied to me.
To which Johnathan says, "You lied to me." Possibly this was to his friends, or perhaps it was to the production team who had led him to believe he was meeting a female love interest. Johnathan had told the team he had no interest in being involved in the show if the crush turned out to be male, and yet here he was with hundreds of onlookers. There was deception here, and it could definitely be seen as frustrating or even humiliating due to the public setting, but this is no excuse for how the story ends. Johnathan doesn't seem too perplexed as he tactfully reaffirms his disinterest in a relationship with Scott. He insists that whilst it is flattering, he himself is straight and only attracted to women. Scott too handles rejection well, and the segment doesn't really have much more to it. After the show, the three of them reportedly hung out in Chicago, and with this water seemingly under the bridge, Johnathan even suggested they all fly home together. Back in Michigan, they all went out partying in a bar, and there appeared to be no bad blood. But 3 days after taping, on March the 9th, 1995, Johnathan returned home from work to a very suggestive note and a gift outside his door. This note, he said, sent him into what he described as gay panic. The note seemingly caused such a reaction within Johnathan that he withdrew cash, purchased a 12-gauge shotgun, and then drove to Scott's trailer. Johnathan initially knocked on the door unarmed to confront Scott. Scott had company, a friend named Gary at the time, but he invited him in. Johnathan, though, was undeterred by Gary's presence, and he asked whether it was Scott that had left the note. Scott confirmed it was, and Johnathan went outside to turn off his engine. As he left for his car, he closed the front door behind him. When he knocked the second time, he faced Scott with a loaded weapon. Scott yelled to his friend Gary for help, and Gary valiantly picked up the only thing to hand, a wicker chair. But before he could help, Scott was hit twice in the chest, the trigger pulled by his crush. This act would end Scott's time on this earth. According to Gary, Johnathan then left immediately. Gary went on to quickly call emergency services. Gary then dialed 911. In a moment of rationality that immediately followed, 24-year-old Johnathan also dialed 911 himself.
Okay, calm down, okay? Okay, why did you do that?
And appeared in court a year later. During the trial, his mental state was questioned heavily. They needed to determine whether the event was premeditated. The prosecution insisted that the purchasing, construction, loading and driving over to Scott's house was proof enough. The defense argued that he suffered temporary insanity due to gay panic, and this was a result of the revelation shared on a talk show, brought back by the Note. They also leaned heavily on a bipolar diagnosis and a tough childhood that had seen him punished for tiny things, leaving him with mental fragility that they claimed led to his extreme actions. The premeditation was initially stated by Johnathan himself at the police station during interview, but the recordings were deemed inadmissible in court. This was because his Miranda rights hadn't been delivered correctly. Johnathan was then sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison for his actions. He did appeal this decision, but it was overturned. Scott's family, disgusted with the show's actions, went after Warner Brothers in court. They blamed the Jenny Jones production for pushing Johnathan to the very edge. During the trial, they tried to prove that the show intended to humiliate the pair for ratings, but Warner, despite admitting it was morally grey at times, insisted that they were neither legally nor financially responsible for Scott's passing. However, the jury that day, after seeing the unaired episode for themselves, believed that the Jenny Jones show had played a huge part. Warner was ordered to pay a huge settlement. The payout was to be more than $20 million. However, the ruling was eventually overturned. The family never saw a penny. Johnathan Scmitz was released on bail in August of 2017. He was released early on good behaviour.